Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan. It is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our culture, our democracy, that is, and how we can work together. See, I took my glasses off if you're watching on YouTube and went right downhill. Anyway, the Democracy Group is a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Be sure to check out our new and improved YouTube channel. Maybe you're already there. Maybe you're one of our first, 250 subs, as I say in the business. We're easy to find if you're not already there. We are dropping video on there now. We are at Politics and Religion, which is same as our website, same as our Patreon, at Politics and Religion with the A and D spelled out, at Politics and Religion on YouTube. Super easy to find. And now, like I said, we're putting video of entire segments of these conversations up there. So join in on the fun. I'll put a link in the show notes and you can become one of our first 1,000 subscribers. That's what we're shooting for in the next few weeks here. Anyway, don't forget our Patreon, writing a review. It all helps so we can continue having great conversations like the one I wanted to have today that's about whether the arguments against Kamala Harris are working. And to cut to the chase, they're not. But before I get into some of those arguments, a little context. When I refer to the arguments against Kamala Harris, there are several layers of who's making these arguments, as well as who's hearing them, who's making them, who's hearing them, and who matters. So we could be talking on a macro level, like the arguments Donald Trump himself is making, or the Trump campaign, or even the RNC for which is, basically is the Trump campaign, the Republican convention, National Committee. I'm also talking about cases that are being made in the media that are then being recycled in various social media platforms. But there's also the personal level, like when we see posts from people we went to high school with, or people from the neighborhood, like in my case, people I went to church with, or the parents of kids that my kids went to school with. So let's just grant that there are a lot of people at all different levels that are talking, but who's actually listening? I mean, we know that Trump's base is listening. It's kind of like super fans of any pop star or rock band. They wake up, the first thing they want to do is turn on music from their favorite singer. They got him in the playlist, and it just makes them feel good. Makes them feel good to play the latest I was going to say Taylor Swift. Maybe that's not built for Donald Trump. Or the Tim McGraw song, or maybe, I don't know, your jam is Duran Duran, and you just can't get enough of Rio, circa 1982. Whatever. I'm sort of joking, but understand there are a lot of folks who are listening to Trump or any number of MAGA-friendly pundits. And don't get me wrong, this applies to a lot of people of all different political stripes. It's what I was talking about a couple of weeks ago on the Epistemological Bubbles and Binkies episode. If you haven't listened to it, it's worth a listen, I think, anyway. What we read, listen to, and watch in terms of politics just tickles our fancy. It's our jam. It makes us feel good just to continue to riff on all the familiar hits that we already know and love, or themes that we already agree with. But here's the thing. People like that, the rabid fan base, really doesn't matter. Your vote, that particular voter isn't going to make a difference. It's not going to swing this election. That vote, the vote of the rabid fan, the people who are going to the MAGA rallies, and I know some people who go, those votes are already baked in. So whether a certain argument resonates with that person or not, frankly, it really doesn't matter, especially if you live in about 40 to 45 states where the result isn't really up for grabs at this point. So in terms of who's listening, there are a number of people in about 7 states that are ultimately going to decide which way this election goes. And to a certain degree, it is about the base, but more precisely, it's about what I'm calling base adjacent voters. That's where you might hear the term GOTV, get out the vote. That's where get out the vote efforts matter. It's about turnout, turnout, turnout. Mike Madrid talked about it last time he was on a week or so ago. So yeah, Kamala Harris is going to win Philadelphia, for example, by a pretty healthy margin. She's going to win the Atlanta area in Georgia. The question is, in those two areas, in those swing states, can the Harris campaign maximize turnout in the areas where she's winning? Or is there just a lack of enthusiasm for whatever reason, to the extent that people who aren't the rabid fans are the most engaged, the ones who wouldn't be waiting in line for hours and hours and hours to get into a rally, just the normal people who have regular lives that don't live and breathe this stuff. If there's a lack of enthusiasm on their part, any reason that reduces the motivation to vote, that can work the other way. So we know the base is coming out to vote, but in terms of the base adjacent voters, is the candidate, the campaign, the surrogates, and the supporters presenting an overall case that maximizes turnout or depresses those numbers? At least that's one of the questions. The other question is with undecided voters. And there are plenty of theories about undecided voters, like who's undecided at this point? Is there anybody really undecided at this point? I won't get too deep into that other than to say, in a lot of cases, it is the least engaged voters, people who just don't pay any attention except for once every 4 years or maybe every 2 years, if that. So these folks, these are folks that aren't reading the politics section of, the websites or the newspapers or whatever. They're not watching Fox News or MSNBC. They're just not tuned in at all. But then when it comes time to vote for president, they might pay a little bit of attention to events like the party's national conventions and maybe the debates. A lot of these folks, a lot of the folks I'm thinking of, people in my life that I know that are this way, end up voting the way they've historically voted, whether it's always Republican or always Democrat, or maybe that's how their families have historically voted. But for one thing, those folks aren't really undecided voters. And good pollsters are able to separate out those who are disengaged but fairly locked in versus those who are disengaged and are still up for grabs. And over the last 8 years during the Trump era, there have been an increasing number of people who have put their votes up for grabs. So you see that in the last several election cycles. Again, if you ask Mike, I keep on referring to Mike Madrid, but he's, he's one of the best in the business. So it's worth talking about his analyses. How Democrats won. One of his points was the way that Democrats won in Arizona in 2020 and 2022, the midterms. He would tell you it's Republicans, registered Republicans, people who've historically voted Republican in Arizona, Republicans who voted for Democrats. Those voters are largely responsible for how the last couple of election cycles went. All that to say, the folks who are going to decide this election are what I'm calling base adjacent voters, not the base adjacent voters, and the mostly disengaged, truly undecided voters. So when I say your arguments against Kamala Harris aren't working, whether it's Trump who's muttering whatever incoherent thought farts are coming out of his pie hole on any given day, or his campaign, his surrogates in the media, or his supporters, the people I have in mind are the base adjacent voters and the undecided voters. And are these arguments going to get more base adjacent voters to turn out in higher numbers and persuade those truly undecided voters in the few opportunities there are when they're actually paying attention to persuade them? Okay, enough level setting. Let's talk about what some of those arguments have been. And I'll just start with a couple of the first objections I heard as soon as Kamala Harris was announced as the nominee. When the party coalesced around her in that week after when Joe Biden dropped out. There were some inside baseball arguments that were going nowhere, frankly. Like a lot of my friends or acquaintances who are Trump supporters, their sudden concern for the democratic process, they're still talking about it. Like, for one thing, that argument was not going to penetrate to the point that base adjacent, undecided, disengaged voters would pay any attention, let alone be moved by it. But personally, I found that line of contention to be kind of sweet, actually. Cute in its own way. Like, that's so nice. Are we concerned about the democratic process all of a sudden? I mean, setting aside that it had to do with the party's nomination process, not the democratic process or the electoral college or anything that's outlined in the Constitution. But listen, There's really no need to get into all of that. It was one of those too cute by half kind of arguments that in comment threads and other insulated forums where only Trump supporters were speaking among themselves, all congratulated themselves for how clever such an argument was. Anyone vaguely familiar with our constitutional process as distinct from how a party's nominees have been chosen didn't really need to take that line of attack too seriously, as I didn't. And to the main point, for the voters that matter, this line of reasoning, such as it was just never going to penetrate. Then you get to some of the first things I heard starting that week when it was becoming clear that Kamala Harris was going to be the Democratic nominee. Some of it, frankly, was just disgusting. I'm not going to give some of these stories the credence of going into detail or repeating the language that I heard in person and that's still being repeated with memes online and even out of Trump himself. But let's just, his references to Willie Brown or whatever. Let's just say a number of people seem to be intensely interested in who Kamala Harris dated earlier in her career as a prosecutor or district attorney, at an early point in her life and her career. My question about this stuff is, why are we talking about this? Why is this an issue? What business is it of mine who she dated way back when? If it's relevant at all, the only thing I want to know were they two consenting adults? Yes? Then shut the hell up. Seriously. And by the way, if we're really going to get all up in arms about a candidate's past relationships, are we really going to are we going to start to get all puritanical about who someone dated throughout their adult lives? Do we really want to go there in this election? Do we really want to talk about one candidate's long record of cheating on spouses, of being found culpable in a court of law of sexual abuse, of having dozens of credible accusers come forward about this candidate's history of being a sexual predator, of paying off porn stars? I mean, if we're going to apply a standard, let's go ahead and apply a standard. And we have one candidate who had consensual relationships among adults. That's none of my damn business. And the other candidate who's exhibited the exact opposite of any sense of decency and morality. And before I get too off the rails, here's where the rubber actually meets the road on this line of attack. If you want to talk about base adjacent voters, the guys that I know who are screaming the loudest about whoever Kamala Harris dated 20-something years ago, their wives are listening. Their daughters are listening. Their sisters are listening. And they're disgusted. So keep talking about a grown woman in such a disparaging way about her private life that's really none of your damn business. And that's a sure way to turn off the other people in your life who maybe aren't listening to the same podcasts you're listening to or watching Fox News all day, every day. But they're nearby. They can overhear it. And not only are they not persuaded by these kinds of attacks, they're disgusted by the ones who are trying to make them. So this particular attack line, if anything, is doing the exact opposite of what you probably think. You meaning those who are trying to make these arguments, unless this sort of thing isn't really meant to persuade at all. Maybe it's just an indulgence. I mean, that's a lot of times that's really all it is. Somebody has like the thought equivalent of an itch, and they just have to, let it. They have to indulge that itch, right? That's it. It makes you feel good. It's meant to be heard by other creeps, so you can all high five each other. And listen, if that's the case, I guess you do you. I don't know. I just don't see the point. There's a mean spiritedness to it, and it only reflects poorly on the person who seems to be obsessed with a grown woman's dating habits from 2 or 3 decades ago. It's just, I mean, I'll say it. It's just weird. So a certain number of base adjacent voters, the sisters, the daughters, the wives, for example, of the guy who's guffawing about these supposed jokes, these lewd references, many of them are just completely disgusted, not by the content of this sort of high school boys locker room gossip. They're disgusted by their husbands or their dads who can't seem to stop talking about it or posting about it. Best case scenario for that dad is they're getting one big eye roll. But they sure as hell ain't convincing their daughter to vote for Trump that way. That's for damn sure. So your weird obsession with Kamala's dating history will not move a single base adjacent or undecided voter in your direction. So let's take another line of attack. This notion that Kamala Harris is supposedly dumb or quote unquote mentally impaired, as Trump put it just the other day. It's been a go-to since she became the nominee, and it's still a regular refrain. For whatever reason, I get the algorithms are working so that I get these posts from, again, high school buddies or old church friends. Whenever they post these memes or these clips or whatever. Just yesterday, as I record this, the ex-president posted a meme on Trump social about Biden needing a VP dumber than me. And this whole thing. Again, I continue to get posts on Facebook and other platforms aggregated to my feed from Trump supporting connections. It's one meme after another about how supposedly dumb Vice President Harris is, or how much of an idiot she is, or taking a clip of something she said and trying to make the point that it's nonsensical or that she's a train wreck. So here's the thing. A person doesn't become a prosecutor, a district attorney, a state attorney general, and a U.S. senator, vice president, who, by the way, was on the ticket that beat the former guy in 2020. You don't get all that by being dumb. One does not just get appointed or elected to serve in all those roles by luck or by chance. It actually takes a great deal of intelligence to not only get appointed, but to serve in all of these roles, not to mention the incredible work ethic and dedication those jobs require. And here's the other thing. When there are moments that these low propensity voters, the undecideds and the base adjacent voters I was referring to a second ago, when there are moments those folks might be paying attention, like a presidential debate, Kamala Harris is clearly not dumb. In fact, if dumb versus smart is one of your top qualifications, let's get real. The other guy on that stage did not avail himself well. Yelling and foaming at the mouth for 90 minutes does not reflect the level of intelligence that some of these folks supposedly value. When Kamala Harris was on the same stage as Donald Trump, there was really no question who came across as not only intelligent, but well-prepared, thoughtful, and strong enough to look in the eye of the bully in chief. She was strategic enough to clearly get under his skin, to the extent that he's still obsessed with some of the things she said, from crowd sizes to the lack of respect and mockery he gets from other world leaders, and even from people in his own cabinet. It takes skilled preparation, focus, and intelligence to have pulled off the performance she did that night. Or our undecided voters and folks who only tune in here and there, they might have caught Kamala Harris's convention speech. Again, these undecided voters and base adjacent voters aren't nearly as online as Donald Trump is. I got to tweet every single impulse at 3 a.m. that pops into my lizard brain. They're not as online as clearly some of my friends from high school and from church are. These folks, the folks that are resharing these memes about Kamala supposedly being dumb, mentally impaired, as he said. Now, undecided voters and folks like that are more concerned about, I don't know, their flower beds, getting kids to school, their jobs, how the Mets are doing. So, by the way, if I'm kind of stumbling over myself, I'm trying to get this done before the game 3 starts, my Mets. So let's go Mets. But they, these folks, the undecideds, the base adjacent voters, they might tune in for the debate. They might tune in for the convention speech. And any objective assessment of Kamala Harris's convention speech would give it extremely high marks. I mean, can we critique, say, the lack of policy depth, if that's your thing, or maybe have differences with some of the policy direction she indicated in that speech? Yeah, absolutely. But one can't come away from that speech thinking that this is an unintelligent person. So the point is, are these attempts at branding Kamala Harris as somehow dumb? Is it working? If the goal of these attacks is just to indulge yourself in your obsessive hatred of Kamala Harris, then God bless you. Whereas my wife's aunties back in Alabama say, bless your little heart. But if the goal is to persuade the actual people who are actually going to make the difference in this election, it ain't working. They might see your post or either scroll, and scroll right past it, or if they give it half a second of a thought, they're wondering, why is this dude so angry? What's with this weird obsession with Kamala Harris? Or maybe even, that doesn't make sense. She seems pretty sharp to me. So if the attack is that she's dumb, and then when the voters that actually matter tune in and see how this person is the furthest thing from dumb, you kind of set yourself up for failure. Seriously. Donald Trump absolutely crashed and burned during that debate because he couldn't help himself in the days and weeks leading up to it, saying how she's dumb as a rock. only to have her eat his lunch on that stage. And let's not forget the other part of what's going to win this election for either side is turning out the base, not just base adjacent. So if there are folks who are leaning or even strongly leaning toward voting for Trump, and part of their motivation is predicated on this notion that Trump's opponent is dumb as a rock, as he put it, and then they tune into the debate or see the big speech at the DNC or catch any number of appearances she's made that's not clipped together with, creative editing and TikTok, and they see that this person is actually super smart. Well, I mean, when they see the reality of it, it's actually demotivating. I mean, they were sold a bill of goods. And it's one thing for, the true believers to buy into Trump's go-to line of don't believe your lying eyes. It's all fake, But for normal people, they can't not see what they see. And this is just one more thing where someone who might be leaning toward Trump might just procrastinate on the whole voting thing and then ultimately decide just to skip the whole thing. So I'm telling you, the whole Kamala is dumb line of attack ain't working for you. One more we could talk about is this notion that Kamala Harris is a flip-flopper. And on its surface, I actually don't mind this one as much, if for no other reason that it at least opens the door for a more substantive, policy-oriented question. But here's the thing. We're talking about attacks that are working. And for the groups we've been talking about that are persuadable, whether it's to vote one way or another, or just to vote at all, the get out the vote, the GOTV efforts, this one is just too in the weeds, even at its best. And even granting that, the way the argument's being made is lacking. The way these talking points have gone is whether it's a news program, a podcast, or just your Facebook pal or whatever, they'll take a clip they grab typically from 2019 when then Senator Harris was running in the Democratic primary, playing to a Democratic base audience, and still, to be fair, still trying to find her voice on the national stage. And then they'll compare it to things she's been saying out on the stump this year. And yeah, guilty as charged. There are a number of policy positions where now Vice President Harris has evolved her positions or even reversed her positions in some instances. And my response to that is great. That's awesome. There are a number of issues that she's trumpeting now where she's become more centrist, which definitely appeals to voters like me. I appreciate that. I appreciate that a lot of her positions, including her convention speech, sound a lot like the kind of speech Mitt Romney or Paul Ryan could have given at their convention as recently as 2012, Republicans. So for a lot of centrists, what some might call flip-flops, I call refreshing. But then these charges, sometimes they take on, well, most all the time, they take on these sinister overtones, like it's all a ploy. She's really the Marxist, the attack line goes. Commie Kamala, they call her. And to that I say, whatever. Whatever. I've heard it all before. Yeah, Biden was supposed to tank the economy, worse than the Great Depression. And yeah, there were some missteps. Inflation was out of hand for a quarter or two. But every indicator is pointing in the right direction. Unemployment has remained at record lows. The stock market continues to break record highs. Inflation's been brought within healthy levels. GDP continues to show solid growth, and even interest rates were lowered by 50 basis points. And if you have any knowledge of other economies around the globe, the U.S. is the envy of every advanced nation in the world. So that's one hell of a Great Depression. Didn't fall off a cliff. Far from it. So, cry me a river about your whole freaking Marxist line. It's not working. And again, it's one of those things that is in the weeds when it comes to the people that we're talking about, what's going to actually swing this election. So let's stop with the hyperbole. The reality is I expect to have policy differences with the Kamala Harris administration. I even expect the Harris administration to make missteps. But that's what democracy is. That's what it's supposed to be. And by the way, if Kamala Harris loses, I also expect her to concede and to participate in the peaceful transfer of power. So any argument that leads to a conversation about policy in this election, this part is where it begins and ends, because anyone who's paying any attention for the last 9 years knows and has to admit, if you have any integrity, if you're connected to reality at all, that if Donald Trump loses this election, he will not concede and will not participate in the peaceful transfer of power. So we could compare and contrast on policies such as they are with a charlatan, a transactional charlatan like Donald Trump. Like you want to talk about flip-flops? I need look no further than what he's said in the last week for flip-flops. His VP choice, J.D. Vance, did a pretty good job at his debate. I'll admit, at least on the surface. But you want to talk about flip-flops? How about going from Trump is America's Hitler to being Donald Trump's #1 bootlicker? There's a flip-flop for you. And yeah, if we're talking about the VP debate, really the only part of that matters of anything J.D. Vance said was at the very end. He would not say that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election and made it perfectly clear that if faced with the choice of doing Donald Trump's bidding or doing what's right, his duty as provided for in the Constitution, it is 100% clear that Vance will torch the Constitution and obediently bow down to the whims of this wannabe authoritarian. So again, you want to talk flip-flopping? You want to talk policy? That's the only policy that matters. Will you participate in the peaceful transfer of power? And not just if you win. And more to the point, is it working for you? Is it going to persuade people who might currently be leaning the other way, those low propensity voters who you only have a small handful of shots of making your case, or those folks who are on the fence about voting at all? Is this going to be the thing that gets them out to vote? Like, they say Kamala, or Kamala, as they keep saying, is a flip-flopper. Well, I just can't stand that. I can't stand any flip-floppers. Now I'm definitely going to go vote against her. The answer is no. No. The answer is it ain't working for you. And I could go through any number of other arguments and attacks they've thrown at Kamala Harris, but the fact is the folks who are watching OANN at Newsmax and Fox News, they're already voting for the Orange God King. Those voters, those numbers are already baked in. These arguments only work as indulgence for them. Indulgence of the need to feel like you're part of the crowd and virtually high-fiving your other buddies in the same crowd, all the folks wearing the same jersey and the same red hats or whatever. But I'm here to tell you, those votes are simply not the votes that are going to make the difference in this election. It's the low propensity, undecided voters and the base adjacent voters, those last few truly undecideds who can be persuaded to check a different box, and the base adjacent voter who can be motivated to actually vote. And when you think about it that way, in a clear-eyed, objective manner, none of these arguments are working for you. So I'll just leave it at that. As always, if you dig what we're doing here, remember to follow this show and write that review. And now you can join the conversation on Patreon. It's patreon.com/politicsandreligion. We're also on YouTube at Politics and Religion. Check it out, subscribe, be part of our first 1,000 subs, as they call it in the biz. Really excited about all of it. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.